Number 9. Jane Klauf. Jane Klauf was a nurse who met her ex-boyfriend, Jonathan Vosa, in 2007. He was an ambulance technician who became abusive early on in the relationship. It soon became clear he was leading a double life with his wife, who he claimed he was divorcing but was still spending intimate time with. But by the time Jane mustered up the courage to end things in 2010, she and Vosa had a child together. After breaking up with him, she went to the police and told them he had assaulted her while pregnant. They charged him in connection to the allegations, but he was later freed on bail, causing Jane to tell police Jonathan would end up killing her. Sadly, just as she predicted, her life came to an end one night in July 2010, when Jonathan stabbed her to death in the parking lot of the hospital she worked at. In what can only be described as a fit of unbridled rage, he plunged a knife into Jane over 70 times and left her on the ground to bleed to death. She was only 26 years old. In the months leading up to her murder, Jane wrote in her diary how she thought Jonathan would kill her. She was especially afraid after reporting him to the police, and he was released. Vosa was sentenced to life in prison, but for Jane's friends and family, the punishment was too little, too late. They were left wondering how and why such a preventable death was allowed to happen in the first place. Number 8. Marylaine Levesque. In 2019, a Canadian convicted criminal named Eustachio Gallese was granted day parole, meaning he was allowed to go out in public during the day for a few approved reasons. Despite the 51-year-old's history of domestic violence, including the murder of his former spouse, the officers overseeing his case let him visit an erotic massage parlor to get the services of sex workers. He had this freedom for less than a year before he brutally murdered a 22-year-old sex worker named Marylaine Levesque back in early 2020. Her lifeless body was found stabbed inside a hotel room. The young woman's death was met with outrage among many. They blamed the parole officers in charge of Gallese's case for what they believed was a completely avoidable tragedy. An in-depth investigation agreed, concluding that the convict's case management team failed to notice warning signs regarding his capacity to reoffend. A coroner for the province of Quebec said an ankle monitor could have prevented Gallese from killing Levesque. Whatever the case may be, he probably won't kill outside of prison walls again. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder for Levesque's death and received a life sentence with possibility of parole after 25 years. If he's still alive when the time comes, he'll be in his late 70s. Number 7. Maya Marano. In late 2021, a 19-year-old college sophomore named Maya Marano went missing in Orlando, Florida. Shortly before she vanished, a 27-year-old maintenance worker named Armando Caballero was seen letting himself into the young woman's apartment in the Arden Villa apartment complex. Maya lived in the building and worked in the leasing office. After entering her home, police noticed it was in disarray and saw blood on Maya's pillow. A week after she went missing, her body was found in a wooded area several miles from where she lived. Her hands and feet were bound, and her mouth was covered by duct tape. She was partially undressed, and her purse was found nearby with her shirt inside. Her body was near Timber Scan, which has been described as Orlando's most troubled condominium complex. It is mostly abandoned, with a reputation for attracting violence, drugs, fires, shootings, and more. So it's no surprise Marano ended up there after finding herself face-to-face with a killer. Sadly, Caballero was never brought to justice. He was found dead after committing suicide just days after Maya disappeared. Cell phone records and other evidence proved that he was most likely the killer, and police have not named or sought out any other suspects in this disappointing case. Number 6. 4th of July tragedy. Mass tragedy struck the US once again earlier this month when a gunman senselessly opened fire on a crowd during a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois, leaving 6 victims dead and many others hurt, including a 2-year-old that was separated from his parents during the chaos. Sadly, many believe the massacre could have been prevented since there were warning signs that went ignored. The suspected shooter, 21-year-old Robert Crimo III, had been flagged by authorities for an attempted suicide and threats of physical violence since 2019. Police confiscated multiple weapons at the time, including 16 knives, a dagger, and a sword. After the recent shooting, the Lake County Major Crimes Task Force spokesman Chris Cavelli said law enforcement ran into roadblocks with previous investigations into the suspect, including a lack of statements signed by other witnesses. Crimo had also made many disturbing social media posts glorifying mass shootings, which have now been removed. The former FBI and ATF investigator Scott Sweeto told CBS News that authorities are getting digitally swarmed with evidence showing how the suspect had plans of murder. He described the content as ultra-violent, but said detectives are now faced with the challenge of weeding through a massive influx of information and determining what could be useful in predicting another disturbed person's plans to commit a future mass shooting. Sweeto also said there are red light laws in 19 states and the District of Columbia that allow the temporary seizure of firearms from seemingly troubled individuals, but those laws don't do much if nobody reports concerning activity. This underlines the importance for people to raise the alarm when they see someone acting strangely, whether it be online or in real life. Number 5. Christian Ferguson. Nearly 20 years ago, in 2003, a 9-year-old special needs child from Missouri named Christian Ferguson vanished into thin air. His father, DeJuan Ferguson, dialed 911 claiming he had been carjacked and that the suspect drove off with Christian in the car. The little boy was never found, and it wasn't until 2019 that authorities charged DeJuan with Christian's murder, saying he wanted to escape the responsibilities that came with fathering a disabled son. At DeJuan's trial, Christian's mother testified he was born with a rare metabolic disorder and had significant medical needs. In 2001, 2 years before he vanished, he slipped into a coma and needed a feeding tube. Christian suffered from major brain damage which rendered him unable to walk or talk. The child required round-the-clock care. Prosecutors accused DeJuan of ignoring signs something was seriously wrong with the boy at the beginning of the medical emergency, since he waited to check on the child until the next day. When the inattentive dad finally took action, it was too late to save Christian from the 6-month hospital stay, which would be followed by lifelong suffering. At his final doctor's appointment just months before he disappeared, Christian lost weight and hadn't grown in height, which, in hindsight, were things medical providers should have reported to authorities as signs of suspected neglect. But as prosecutor John Schlesinger pointed out, their failure to do so does not mean Ferguson was not proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. DeJuan was recently convicted of first-degree murder in connection with his child's disappearance, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Number 4. Scott Beal. 40-year-old Scott Beal entered Hot Yoga Tallahassee one evening in November 2018 with a 9mm pistol in his bag. During the class, he shot and killed a 21-year-old college student, Maura Binkley, and a 61-year-old doctor named Nancy Van Vessem. He then used the gun to smack a male employee who tried to stop the shooting and turned the gun on himself. Before this incident, Beal had a long history of disturbing behavior. He was kicked out of the army and had lost at least 4 teaching jobs for sexually harassing colleagues and students. He had a record of groping and stalking women, and he was also known for posting racist and misogynistic content on social media sites. Interview with Beal's friends and family members revealed even more details about his troubled past, going all the way back to his teenage years. when he began openly and descriptively discussing his violent hatred toward women. The Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Center concluded in its report on the killings that there were multiple missed warning signs about Beal's violence that somehow flew under the radar of local law enforcement. While the report said there was no surefire way to predict a mass murder, there are many signs to watch out for, including homicidal fixations, a history of being bullied, financial instability, mental health issues, intense anger, and a lack of meaningful consequences for previous minor offenses. Even more disturbing, the report claims misogynistic extremism is becoming a growing threat in American society. Hopefully, these findings motivate law enforcement to take reports of potential violence seriously. Number 3. Rean Gibbs. 25-year-old Rean Gibbs' life was cut short earlier this year after she was murdered in her apartment in Lawrence, Kansas. Her own husband, 27-year-old Chad Marek, told police that God told him to kill her. He faces a first-degree murder charge in connection to Regan's death, which brought her dreams of helping the homeless, mentally ill, and less fortunate to an abrupt stop. As it turned out, Marek had a history of domestic violence convictions that only came to light after her death. The Lawrence Journal-World reported he had been repeatedly sentenced to probation for these crimes. For Regan's grieving family, her untimely death highlights the dangers of domestic violence. Shortly after she was killed, they traveled to Lawrence to raise awareness about warning signs of abuse in relationships. Regan's loved ones told the local news how they noticed disturbing changes when she moved back to Kansas after leaving a behavioral health job in Arizona. They said Marek pulled Regan away from them by manipulating her with her religious beliefs. He allegedly isolated her from everyone else in her life. Her mother, Kristen Gibbs, said she only met Marek once, and even then his pull on Regan was very evident. Eventually, the family only heard from Regan through occasional phone calls that she had to make over speakerphone in front of her husband. Her loved ones were left feeling helpless as they tried but were unable to free her from Marek's constant watch. Kristen urged the public not to ignore warning signs of abuse and to be relentless in attempts to help someone that they're worried about. She also stressed the importance of learning about and studying the signs that could indicate someone is in a dangerous relationship. Number 2. Robert Vosa. In late 2021, the former Baltimore cop Robert Vosa kidnapped his daughters in Pennsylvania. Police were told about the abduction when a woman called 911 saying Vosa and a co-conspirator assaulted her for nearly 24 hours before disappearing with the kids. She claimed her attackers bound her, forced her to take drugs, and held her captive. Just days later, Vosa and the girls were found dead, along with Taya Bynum, a Baltimore County sergeant who had been suspended at the time. The victim who made the initial complaint said Bynum was a co-conspirator in the assault against her. In the next few days, news reports claimed that there could have been delays in law enforcement's response to the 41-year-old and his missing children. It took a full day after the initial complaint for the York Area Regional Police to act on a search warrant of his home, but by this time, the home was empty. Investigators apparently remained a step behind the suspect for the entirety of the manhunt, which ended after they found Vosa, Bynum, and the kids dead from a murder-suicide. The tragic ending to the bizarre case has left many wondering if the deaths could have been prevented, if only police had responded faster to the situation or took it more seriously. Number 1. Sarah Everard. 33-year-old Sarah Everard was kidnapped one night in early 2021 while walking home from a friend's house in South London. It was a bizarre abduction carried out by the Metropolitan Police officer Wayne Cousin, who told Sarah he was taking her into custody for COVID-19 violations. He drove her to the outskirts of the town of Dover, where he assaulted and strangled her before burning and disposing of her lifeless, abused body. In the aftermath of Everard's murder, many criticized police for failing to prevent the disturbing crime from taking place. They accused law enforcement of not noticing warning signs, including a 2015 indecent exposure incident involving the killer, as well as 2 other similar incidents that were never thoroughly investigated. There was also an instance where a prostitute went into the police station demanding money from cousin, and other allegations that he assaulted a drag queen in 2018. In other words, his misconduct was more than evident. It was concrete. Cousin's wife was also left reeling as she felt haunted by her failure to notice the signs that he was capable of such unspeakable violence and hatred. But at the end of the day, she was just one of many who overlooked his behavior. Thankfully, this was probably the last time he will hurt an innocent victim, since he pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison.
9. Ibn Collins. Early one morning in January 2019, a 39-year-old New Jersey man named Ibn Collins mowed down an elementary school teacher named Megan Crilly as she passed through an intersection with her 3 friends in her car. Ibn was allegedly driving drunk at the time. The woman was thrown 140 feet, 43 meters from the collision, and died 11 days later in the hospital from her injuries. Authorities claimed Collins spent the next few months meticulously and quietly repairing the damage on his Jeep Grand Cherokee inside his auto repair garage in hopes of destroying evidence and avoiding accountability for his actions. The suspect was accused of claiming he'd hit a deer when ordering replacement parts. But detectives were determined to get to the bottom of the hit-and-run case that took 35-year-old Crilly's life. They eventually found enough evidence and were able to charge Collins with manslaughter and tampering with evidence. Some evidence they found included a damaged bumper at a salvage yard they managed to trace back to Collins' Jeep. Collins' lawyer argued that the case should be dismissed and challenged the prosecutor's allegations that he was drunk at the time of the crash. The outcome of the case is unclear, but hopefully justice was served. 8. Jesse Franklin Hill. In one of the latest bizarre Florida man stories to hit news headlines, a 42-year-old man named Jesse Franklin Hill was recently charged with manslaughter and tampering with evidence in connection to his roommate's death. One morning in early May this year, Hill was alerted by 44-year-old Ernie Wayne Wilburn yelling from outside after he'd forgotten his keys and was locked out of their home. Hill's girlfriend would later tell investigators Hill grabbed a .22 caliber air rifle and shot at Wilburn through the window. An affidavit describes how a visitor came by several hours later to tell Hill there was a corpse in his living room. Hill then began talking about what to do with Wilburn's body or how to explain its presence to the police. He eventually called the authorities, who learned from witnesses that Hill tried to conceal his roommate's body using a sheet and couch cushions. Wilburn's body was found several feet away from a noticeable bloodstain, which supports the narrative bystanders gave police, and the air rifle Hill used to kill him was found in some nearby bushes where he tried to hide it. And this all happened after detectives tried to reach Hill several times, but were told that he'd taken flight after revealing he was a homicide suspect, despite never being told he was in the first place. An autopsy determined the victim's death was a homicide. After being taken into custody, Hill told the investigators he killed Wilburn because the man simply annoyed him. Hill claimed he didn't realize the air rifle he used was so powerful, but the owner of the home he lived in said he had warned Hill about the weapon's capabilities. He will now have to face the music for his crimes in court. 7. Cheating husband removes passport pages. A news website called The Tiger recently reported on a 32-year-old man from Pune, India, that was arrested for tearing pages out of his passport. He supposedly did it before getting married because he didn't want his new wife to know about past trips he took to Thailand. But she still found out in the worst possible way. The man was trying to board a flight to the Maldives at Mumbai International Airport when security noticed missing passport pages. And while his lawyer claims the binding came loose and the pages just fell out, officials claimed it looked like the pages were torn out on purpose and accused the suspect of tampering with his passport. While it's unclear why he wanted to cover up his visits to Thailand, the man is accused of ripping out 10 pages from 2019 before his wedding, so perhaps it's safe to assume he was worried his future bride would think he went there for some nefarious reasons. But since passports are considered a federally issued document, it's a crime in most countries to tamper with them in any way, making the man's attempt to cover up his travel history a huge no-no. He reportedly faces multiple charges, including forgery, cheating, and using a forged document or electronic record as genuine, as well as some other offenses under India's Passport Act. 6. A police cover-up in Iowa. On December 10, 2020, police in Manchester, Iowa tried to stop a motorcycle rider named Augustin Gus Mormon, but he refused to pull over, leading to a chase. And while local attorney Dave O'Brien conceded that law enforcement had valid reasons for pursuing Gus, he's accusing the city of Manchester and 2 of its police officers for engaging in a dangerous chase that ultimately led to the crash, causing the suspect's death. O'Brien, who represents Mormon's family, wrote in his lawsuit that Lieutenant James Wessels continued the pursuit even after law enforcement stopped the chase outside Manchester legal city limits. He described Wessels' behavior as reckless and certainly negligent, claiming the lieutenant deliberately ran Mormon's motorcycle off the road, and that his police car came into contact with the bike twice, resulting in the deadly crash. If this is true, it seems awfully suspicious. Speaking with CBS 2 Iowa, O'Brien said Wessel accused Mormon of causing the crash even though he was the one chasing. The attorney hired an accident reconstruction specialist, who concluded the crash did not happen the way Wessel described, and that Wessel's vehicle turned into the motorcycle and hit it. O'Brien also claims to have evidence pointing toward a police cover-up of what actually happened. Adding to his suspicions is the lack of video evidence about the incident, which he described as a conspiracy at a minimum, adding how he believes his team caught police manipulating evidence red-handed. While the allegations are not being weighed in a criminal court, they are being used in a wrongful death civil lawsuit on behalf of Mormon's family, who are hoping to receive compensation for all the grief they've been put through. 5. Tony Mota. Labeled as a real-life Tony Soprano, Tony Mota was born in the Dominican Republic, but he immigrated to the US and made a living acting as a gangster in the New Jersey and New York City region. In December 1997, he and a group of fellow co-conspirators abducted a 38-year-old Queens man named Eddie Acevedo, who allegedly owed over $180,000 in drug-related debts. Over the next 24 hours, the group contacted Acevedo's friends and family in an attempt to recover some of the missing money. When the man's loved ones were only able to raise $23,000, his wife offered the gangsters her car and a Rolex. They agreed to take these in exchange. But Acevedo never returned home even after they collected the ransom. His wife contacted police, but by the time they caught up with the criminals, it was already too late to save Acevedo's life. The drug dealers told Mota and his fellow gang members that Acevedo was a snitch that needed to die, so they shot him in the head. In an attempt to destroy the evidence, Acevedo's kidnappers then set his car on fire with the man's body inside. But the plan failed, and 4 months later, investigators arrested a gangster named Bienvenido Casilla for his role in the crime. They soon set out on a manhunt for Mota through a federal indictment for multiple charges. By the time detectives found him in the town of Nitsayo in the Dominican Republic last year, they learned he'd recently died of a heart attack at the old age of 62. Mota successfully evaded law enforcement for over 2 decades while living under the alias Miguel Angel Gonzalez Perez. But his failure to separate himself from the crime cost him his comfortable life in the States and forced him to spend his remaining years living under a low profile without the freedom of movement he'd spent much of his life enjoying. It was probably much different from how Mota had originally envisioned his later years. But hey, that's the price you pay for taking another man's life. Police later had his body exhumed and connected his DNA with samples from evidence involved in Acevedo's murder. 4. Sandy Graham. During the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, 32-year-old Sandy Graham shot and killed her 40-year-old partner, Dale Watine, in New Zealand's South Island. She then went to her best friend George Hyde to ask for help hiding the man's body. The pair put Hyde's 2 young children into the backseat of his car, along with some shovels, and drove into a secluded forest where they dug Watine's grave. Hyde then returned to the site later on and buried his remains. Graham and Watine met in 2019 and went on to have a volatile relationship that saw occasional visits from police for complaints. Watine was last seen in April this year, and police began to suspect foul play after they found his SUV abandoned near Graham's home. Graham told investigators that she last saw Watine days earlier when he left her house to pick up some beer, and how she had no idea where he was or what could have happened to him. She listed multiple places and people she said might lead detectives to him, all while knowing fully well he was dead and buried in the ground. In the meantime, Graham began acting concerned about Wateen's well-being. She claimed he owed money to a gang, could be with his meth dealer, or perhaps he'd gone on a bender, which he was known to do fairly often. Rumors began to spread through the small town that Wateen might have been murdered, and all signs pointed investigators in the same direction. Graham continued to put on a disturbingly convincing act during early interrogations, but Hyde seemed suspicious. After extensive searching, police finally found Wateen's body. Shortly after that, Hyde confessed to his role in hiding the murder's evidence. Graham was recently found guilty of Wateen's murder, while Hyde was convicted of being an accessory to the crime after the fact. 3. Kevin Michael Baker Jr. One family's Christmas Eve ended in tragedy last year when a 65-year-old grandfather from Croydon, Pennsylvania named John Dugan was struck by a vehicle while on his way to a holiday party. He'd fallen in the road when a red pickup truck mowed him down and left the scene, leaving him bleeding out with fatal head injuries. Local police put out photos of the vehicle on social media in hopes someone would recognize it and identify the owner. Soon enough, a local man named Kevin Baker Sr. brought the pickup to the police station, claiming he believed it looked a lot like the one in the pictures. He and his son Kevin Baker Jr., the truck's owner, consented to a search of the car, which was brand new, only a few months old. The inspector noticed damage that was consistent with the collision that killed Duggan, but he also saw something strange. The truck was extremely clean. A few months later, 20-year-old Baker Jr. was charged with accident involving death or personal injury, tampering with physical evidence, and failure to stop and give information or render aid. Most of these charges could have been avoided if he'd just stayed at the scene, according to the Bucks County District Attorney's Office. A grand jury has accused Baker, his father, and his girlfriend of failing to be entirely truthful about the incident that caused Duggan's untimely death. Any fabricating or attempts to conceal evidence on their part only made Baker's circumstances worse. Had he simply stayed put and dealt with the consequences of his actions at the scene of the crime, he probably would have only received a traffic ticket. But he is now being held accountable. 2. Jack Woodley. 18-year-old Jack Woodley was brutally killed in northeast England at the end of last year by a gang of adolescents who punched, kicked, and stomped the young man before fatally stabbing him in the back. The attackers tried to hide the murder weapon and their blood-stained clothing, thinking they could avoid being arrested by concealing the crime's evidence. But witnesses observed what was going on, and police managed to find the knife despite one of the suspects saying it would never be found. Woodley's DNA and the DNA of one of the defendants was found on the weapon, along with signs it had been cleaned after it was used to kill Jack. One witness reported someone had tried to pay them to take and hide the blood-stained clothing. 10 teenagers were arrested in connection to the incident. One of them admitted to manslaughter, but they all denied committing the murder. A jury recently found all 10 suspects guilty of killing Woodley. They remain in custody while awaiting their sentences. 1. Co-conspiring colleagues. Earlier this year, police charged 5 employees of a Christian school in Midland, Texas, on suspicion they knew about abuse going on and failed to report it to the police. While limited details of the case have been released to the public, records revealed several high-ranking staff members of the school had been interviewed about an alleged assault shortly before the arrests were made. It's unclear exactly what happened, but the incident reportedly involved hazing and took place in the school stadium. Based on what little information was given freely to the press, an unidentified, likely underage victim was in the locker room when the lights went out. The student was then told it was freshman initiation day and was brutally beaten to a pulp, according to Newsweek. The school superintendent is accused of refusing to answer questions or hand over documents related to the attack to law enforcement. He claimed an investigation was underway, but when investigators executed a search warrant, they found no evidence the incident was actually being looked into. They also supposedly uncovered emails showing how school officials refused to report the assault to authorities. The 5 staff members that were arrested in connection to the case were originally charged with failing to report abuse with intent to conceal. A grand jury decided against indicting the employees, but the case remains controversial and has certainly generated a lot of doubt and unwanted attention among the public towards the school itself and the faculty. 10. Attack in the Bahamas. In 2018, Will Krause was spearfishing in the Bahamas with a group of friends when he had a rather unexpected encounter with a reef shark. Reef sharks are not typically that dangerous. People aren't quite as afraid of these sharks as they are of great whites, but they're still sharks and they still have extremely sharp teeth. Will was lucky to survive when the 7-foot, 2.1 meter long monster grabbed his head and neck and nearly chomped his entire torso in half. After the nightmare was over, Will was speaking with news crews and said the only thing he can remember is the sound. He was underwater, swimming around, and then suddenly the shark's mouth covered his whole head. He recalls a distinct crunching noise, like his ears were filled with cracking of sticks. In reality, that crunching sound was the shark's teeth ripping his flesh open. For some unknown reason, the shark decided to spit Will out instead of fully eating him. It left him with huge, gaping wounds. Will was bleeding profusely the entire boat ride back to the shore. Yet it could have been so much worse. If the shark had bitten him a few more times, Will may have lost his head. 9. Lost in Malaysia. In April of 2022, Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency officers were on the hunt for foreign divers who'd gone missing off the coast of Johor's Mersing. 3 Europeans and their instructor surfaced from a dive but couldn't find their boat. They'd gone too deep. There was nobody on the boat to keep track of them, and when they came up out of the water, they were in the middle of nowhere. A British man in his 40s named Adrian, a teenage French girl named Alexia, and the British man's Dutch son, Nathan. What followed was an absolute nightmare for everyone involved. After diving for about 40 minutes, then surfacing and not finding their boat, they began to drift in extremely strong ocean currents. This drifting ended up separating them. They were then stuck at sea for days, surviving only thanks to their diving buoy and by drinking the rainwater. Finally, the instructor was discovered. She was rescued in the waters off of southern Malaysia the day after they were sent adrift. Then the British man and the French girl were discovered shortly after in the waters of Indonesia. The pair had floated over 80 miles, 129 kilometers from where they'd started. They were quickly taken to the hospital and reported in stable condition. Sadly, Nathan didn't make it. The British man's son, who was only 14, was the only one in the party to drown. As for the boat captain who was responsible for the whole mess, he was arrested by the police when he tested positive for drugs. 8. Water filter horror. On March 27, 2021, a young Mexican boy was killed at a water amusement park in a tragic swimming accident. It happened at the Zenzi's Park in Playa del Carmen. The boy was at the Rapid River ride when he got sucked into the water filter system. According to the local news reports, his name was Leonardo Luna Guerrero, and he was visiting the park with his parents. He was sucked into the water filter system because one of the employees had left it open. So when little Leonardo swam by, there was no metal grill over the filter, and it inhaled him like a giant vacuum. After this horrifying swimming accident, the boy's father, who happens to be a respected cardiologist, took to social media to accuse the park of negligence. He told the public about how he had to free his son from the water filter with the help of other visitors because the force of the suction was too great for him to do it on his own. After he got his boy out of the water, he performed CPR. But he'd been underwater too long and there was no resuscitating him. The boy's father also complained that the staff at the park had no idea how to perform first aid. They left the dangerous grill open, and they didn't even have the knowledge to help any drowning victims. Even more horrifying is the fact that after this man's son died from a pulmonary hemorrhage brought on by drowning, the hospital forced him to sign an indemnity form. The form was designed to protect the park from legal action. It was the only way the hospital would agree to give his son's body back. 7. Croc attack. It was in the summer of 2020 when a 30-year-old man in India found himself being dragged underwater by a crocodile. His name is Amit Jatav, and he was only saved because his quick-thinking friend managed to beat the crocodile off with a selfie stick. The terrifying incident happened at the Kaliasot Dam in Bhopal. Amit and his friend had gone down to the lake because they were bored during the lockdown. These guys work in the local shops, and they didn't really have any business, all things considered. So they were splashing and playing in the shallow water of the dam and recording themselves with the selfie stick. Then, from out of nowhere, a crocodile clamped its teeth onto Amit's thigh and dragged him under the water. According to what Amit told the Times of India from his hospital bed, he thought it was all over for him. Luckily, his friend Gadendra came to the rescue. He dove into the water after the crocodile, who at this point had taken Amit about 6 feet, 1.8 meters deep. And he had a selfie stick like a spear in front of him. He poked the sharp part of the stick against the vicious water reptile, and it was just enough for the croc to release Amit's body. But he was still in some serious trouble. Amit's thigh was ripped apart pretty badly by the crocodile's teeth. He needed to have 30 stitches because a huge chunk of his thigh had been ripped right out. 6. Heart attack in the water. In 2017, a 61-year-old man died while diving off the Canary Islands. He was actually the 3rd British death in the area that year, an expat who'd been visiting a unique underwater exhibit. He's only been identified by his initials LG. He'd gone with a group to visit the Underwater Atlantic Museum, or the Museo Atlantico, the very first underwater art museum to ever open to the public in Europe. But what nobody had anticipated was that LG would become extremely unwell during the dive. There was something majorly wrong, and he had to be helped back up to the surface and onto a rescue boat. When rescuers finally got his suit off, they realized this guy was having a heart attack. It had started while he was taking a leisurely dive, looking through more than 300 sculptures sitting at the bottom of the sea floor, about 45 feet, 13.7 meters deep. It took so long to get back to the shore that by the time the boat touched down, the poor man was already dead. 5. Sydney shark attack. In early 2022, one of the most horrific shark attacks in human history took place off the coast of Sydney, Australia. The entire thing was captured on video, and it's quite graphic. A swimmer was out in the ocean, minding their own business on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a pretty busy day. People were fishing, everyone was relaxing in the sand. And then, about 100 feet, 30 meters out into the water, the blue suddenly turned red. It was as if a miniature blood volcano had just started erupting under the water. And that was when the people on the beach realized someone was being attacked. In the video footage, you can hear someone screaming, "Shark! Big, great, white." And sure enough, there was a truly monstrous great white shark clearly eating the swimmer who'd been there just moments ago. There was absolutely nothing the paramedics could do when they arrived at the scene. The victim was in such bad condition that all paramedics could do was package up their remains and get them off the beach. It was the first fatal shark attack in Sydney since 1963. 4. Terror at Lake Pleasant. A 32-year-old woman by the name of Tehahan Smith died at Lake Pleasant in May of 2022. According to Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, she died following a brutal accident with a boat. She'd been swimming at about 5 p.m. when her leg came into contact with a boat propeller and was severed. It happened immediately upon jumping into the water. She leapt out the back of the boat, hit the water, kicked out with her leg, and her leg was cut clean in half by the propeller. She had to be airlifted to the hospital, but sadly died shortly after her arrival. And believe it or not, this was the 5th weekend in a row that the police had to respond to a similar incident at this exact same lake. The previous Sunday, an 18-year-old drowned while swimming near Sunset Ridge. And on May 8th, an 83-year-old man named Rosario Benitez was thrown off his boat because of a sudden gust of wind and died. And on the 2 consecutive weekends prior to the wind death, 2 men drowned. So far this year, somebody has died pretty much every single weekend at Lake Pleasant, and almost always in a bizarre or gruesome fashion. 3. Sucked into a nuclear power plant. A scuba diver was accidentally sucked into a nuclear power plant intake pipe. His name is Christopher LeCun, and he had no idea that while he was scuba diving off the coast of Florida, he was doing so right near a massive pipe from the St. Lucie power plant. The power plant pulls in about 500,000 gallons of ocean water every minute, using the enormous intake pipe. Anything that gets sucked in there is basically lost, even a human being. It was one of the scariest situations Christopher had ever been in. It was so turbulent inside the intake pipe that it took him nearly a minute just to figure out which way was up and which way was down. He had to hang on to his diving mask because of the force of the suction that was trying to suck it off his face. He then spent the next 5 minutes tumbling through pure darkness as he travelled up the pipe, which is about a quarter of a mile long. Then, as quickly as the whole nightmare started, it was over. The pipe spat him out into a canal. It was a pond inside the actual nuclear power plant. He touched down in a kind of filter pool with fish. He saw Goliath groupers and even massive tar ponds that had been slurped in with him. He also saw a worker standing over him, totally perplexed. Christopher ended up being really lucky, as the nuclear plant worker said he and his colleagues were about to leave for the night. 5 minutes later, and the whole place would have been closed, and Christopher would have been stuck inside until the next day. 2. The deadly penguin dive. Spencer Brown finished his course in cybersecurity in 2021. But because of the pandemic that was going on, New York University wasn't holding any in-person graduations. So to celebrate his finished course, his wife decided to throw a big party at her parents' house in Alpine. The party was held on July 29, 2021. Everyone was hanging around outside by the pool. There were about 50 people eating cake, ice cream, swimming, and just having a good time. Everyone was happy, and Spencer most of all because he was also expecting his third child. And then, everything got very dark very quickly. Spencer found himself at the end of the diving board. He put his arms to the sides to do the penguin dive, something he'd done hundreds of times before. He jumped off the diving board, hit the water like a human torpedo, and his head smashed against the concrete at the rise where the shallow end of the pool starts. His neck and spine absorbed the impact, and he was dragged out of that pool an incomplete quadriplegic. He has very little sensation these days below his neck. He doesn't know if he's hungry, and he can't even tell if something's too hot or too cold. He has central cord system, according to his doctor at the University of Utah. His arms and hands are weaker than his legs, and he has spastic involuntary muscle movements. Hopefully one day he'll be able to walk on his own, but for now, Spencer's stuck in a wheelchair, all because of a bad dive off the diving board. 1. A rare brain infection. In August of 2016, a woman from New York died of a rare brain infection after she went swimming. She was a student, just 19 years old and living in Kingston. According to the New York State Health Department, Kerry Stoutenberg's official cause of death was caused by an amoeba called Naegleria fowleri. The amoeba is contracted usually when someone goes swimming. It enters in through the nose, forces its way on the olfactory nerve into the brain, and causes a crippling infection called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. This young student went for a swim somewhere in Cecil County to beat the summer heat. An amoeba swam up her nose, and she was dead by the end of the month. The fatality rate for this thing is over 97%, although infections are pretty rare. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say there were only 37 of these infections from between 2006 to 2015. They say if you don't want an amoeba to swim up your nose and into your brain, you should always wear a nose clip when you go in fresh water. Thanks for watching. Would you rather contract a brain infection or get attacked by a giant shark? Let us know what your biggest swimming nightmare is in the comments below. And remember to hit subscribe if you haven't yet. See you next time. Bye.